stay running, please. Okay, now it's okay. Well, that's something. Well, now it idles too much. Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is almost creepy. It is very, very close to an identical twin to my Challenger, except it's a 70, and I don't know, there's some stuff. It's going to be immediately apparent to you that this car is a work in progress. It needs quite a bit. Anyway, today we're going to go through a bunch of stuff on this car. We're going to tune it. We're going to try and make the electrical system work and things like that. Yes, continue running. Thank you. This is interesting. And it actually works, kinda. Okay, I instantly like one thing about this very much. There's no door buzzer. I've been informed that Super Coupes use this wheel setup. It's essentially a cop wheel with that cap and with a finish ring on it. Notice there are no nibs on that wheel for a dog dish. I'll be the first to tell you, I'm not an E-body guy. I'm an A-body guy, stuck in an E-body world. That's probably why I've only ever owned one. It was a pretty ratty, yellow 1973 Dodge Challenger. Of course, the 73 has different taillights and a frowny face, but, you know, the general body, the dash, the interior, most stuff is the same. And of course, my car was an original 344-speed rally, so it had the lumpy rally hood, just like this one. Much like that car I owned, which you've seen on the channel in recent months. It's black now and actually, kind of looks nice. This one has seen some stuff. Now, I certainly don't have the whole history on this car. I do know that the owner essentially bought it as you see it, and then the engine blew up, so he built a different engine for it. And it's starting to rain. This is a 440 big block. Specifically, this is actually a truck or motorhome block with aluminum stealth heads on it, and fancy valve covers, nice new Edelbrock Performer RPM intake, fancy Holley double pumper carb, aluminum water pump housing, lots and lots of nice parts. I completely failed to mention a couple important things while filming, so I'll do that now. This is not an RT, this is an original 318 Challenger. It shouldn't have a lumpy hood, but it does. And notice the beige paint in the engine compartment. This is actually an original beige Challenger, and I believe it's going back to that color. So the engine compartment's been painted. As you can see, it's not quite finished. ARP valley pan bolts and fancy billet hold downs. Never seen that before, ever. Anyway, if you have any questions about what the engine is specifically, you can go right here to the number pad. Notice it's stamped 7T440. It's a truck block. That's all we really need to know. It does not have an external balance damper on it. In fact, it has some kind of fancy performance one. So I'm guessing it no longer has the original cast crank, or if it does, it's been neutral balanced. These headers are obviously older, somewhat aged, and as you can see, they were never meant to clear power steering. You heard what the engine sounds like. Actually, pretty peppy, but, well, it needs some help. The fact that it won't idle most of the time, that's a bit of an issue. Beyond that, though, we kind of have an electrical nightmare, which is not uncommon for a car like this. Yeah, I'll tell you right now, we're going to be getting a whole engine harness for this. This is just bad. Someone has... Yeah, it's bad. First order of business. The car would not crank with the key. In fact, there's a really neat switch under here that was making that happen. But I figured it out pretty quickly. I don't know why, but someone had disconnected the key trigger wire off of the starter relay and ran it with a jumper up to the coil positive connection on the ballast resistor. I was thinking that it might have been a cranking power issue, but I corrected it and hit the key and it fired right up perfectly, so I don't know. Let's just say it's fixed now. Yay! Few things in life bring me the kind of joy that making a pile of extra useless electrical parts does. And don't worry, this pile is going to get much larger. First though, I want to address that giant runnability issue. This is a shiny, almost brand new Brawler carburetor. You would think the thing would idle. I know something about Holleys that someone didn't. There's an extra nipple off the back of the base plate on these double pumpers. So I'm going to go ahead and put a cap on it, and then I bet we'll be able to tune this thing. Okay, well, it still doesn't run the best. I hear some small header leaks everywhere. Those are not Remplex gaskets. That would be why. Basically, get Remplex gaskets or don't bother. Anyway, I have a suspicion that these screws are not set correctly. Actually, they might be really close. About 3/4 to 1 turnout is what you want with a 4-corner system like this. And then you need the idle speed balanced front to rear. So I'm gonna do that. We'll see what that does. Yeah, I just kind of tweaked the screws a little bit. The settings were pretty close. I lowered the idle speed and this thing sounds rowdy. I don't know anything about the cam specs in this engine, but judging by the pieces on the outside, it's got something. Obviously, I do need to get into the timing. We'll see what that's like, but wow, this thing's gonna be kind of fun. Well, it's like a really long time later. I pulled the distributor and re-stabbed it in roughly the correct direction so the vacuum pod isn't hitting the radiator hose anymore. Then I timed it at 36 degrees total, which helped a bit, I guess. Yeah, now it's actually raining, so I gotta put this thing away for the day, but it actually runs good now. I don't know which warning light that is stuck on because the label's missing. They did put a piece of red plastic back over it. So add that to the list, I guess. Also, the temp gauge doesn't work, although it is hooked up. And apparently the fuel gauge reads low. It's not actually gonna be a gauge issue. I can pretty much guarantee that's a sending unit thing. Well, it's like, is it 3 months later? I don't even know. 2 months? 7 weeks? Not sure. Anyway, I'm working on this Challenger again, and currently I'm fixing all of these horrible electrical nightmares under the hood. This is the original engine harness, or what's left of it. It's bad. It's really bad. So we've got this brand new reproduction. I believe this is an M&H, although it could be the other one. Ah yes, this is an Evans. Also quite good. To be honest, I don't really see any daylight between the two. They're both nice products. Anyway, I've got the old one cut out, and I do mean cut out because the charge wire was run through the firewall connector up to the gauge thingy. So there's another thing I have to fix, but I think if I throw this back on real quick, it should still at least run so we can move it out of the way. It's a bit of a moot point anyway because I need to put an entire dash harness in this thing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Did I mention this thing's gonna need a suspension overhaul? And it makes horrible creaking noises. I think I did. Well, I'd like to check my work, but unfortunately the keys are in the trunk where I left them. Why is that like that? Is that accurate or broken? Reads the same with the battery disconnected, so broken. All right, good. Anyway, it should run now, but it shouldn't charge. All right. Just a little cold-blooded, but yeah. Replacing one of these Mopar engine harnesses really isn't hard, and it's very rewarding. It's a simple way to unscrew everything around your engine. It's not even all that expensive, really. Because these things are built just like factory wiring, they lay out just like factory wiring. You plug it into the firewall, you kind of throw it at the engine, and it's going to show you where everything needs to be connected. It's not hard to figure out. If it is hard to figure out, I don't know, consult a wiring diagram or something. Anyway, previously, what was left of the hacked up original harness was running under the intake. I did not do that. I put it in the factory location here. The clever thing would be to add like a clamp, either off the valve cover or off the intake here, just to hold it in place, but it's not that big a deal. There's plenty of cars with aftermarket covers running around just like this. Oh, there's an ampy thing back here. Anyway, from the collection of Mr. Hergert, we've got a spare wiring harness. In fact, we've got two, and they appear to be complete. It just so happens a month or two ago, Tom brought home this gigantic pile of e-body parts, which are still sitting in the way in the shop. There used to be a car here. One of the great things that came with that pile, wiring harnesses for e-bodies, Challengers, and Barracudas. In fact, there are multiple totes and boxes full, so that's excellent. This one looks to be in pretty good shape. I did separate out the taillight harness. Hopefully we don't need that. It's hacked up anyway. In case there's anything wrong with this one, like maybe one connector is messed up, there's an entire second harness for parts. There are also two gauge clusters here, so between all this different stuff, I imagine there's some way to make everything work. There's also a shiny new sway bar in a box. Is that my job? I can't say I'm particularly excited to replace the dash harness either. It's a giant pain with everything together in the car. I'll have to drop the column down, pull out the gauge lighting panel thing, which is here. In e-bodies, they have bulbs that shine this way at the lights instead of being backlit like everything else in the universe. Then the switch plate has to come out, the heater controls have to come loose, that aftermarket stereo will definitely be in the way, and then I can remove the actual cluster and bezel assembly. I did have to do this exact same job on my Challenger, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it is a pain. But it's 6:45 p.m., so I suppose that's all a future Jamie problem now. Dude, that should not sound like that. It's days later, and the dash is coming apart in the Challenger. Carefully. Here's that white plate I was talking about. It's held in place with 6 screws, which are easily removed. Unfortunately, the power lead runs back behind the gauges, and it's a huge pain to deal with, so I'll leave this precariously dangling off to the right side for now. I've already removed the 2 lower trim pieces, which was easy enough because the really annoying screws that come in from the backside weren't there. That's a common feature. I've got to pull the switch plate and the bezel, which I can now do using this row of screws I've revealed by dropping the light plate. If you've ever done a cluster on a B body or even an A body, then you know those just kind of screw into the dash. You get the column out of the way, and then you loosen it and you remove it. These E-bodies, for whatever reason, are absolutely ridiculous. Totally unlike that. All of these things are individual pieces. Pro tip, if you're having wiper problems in your E-body, there's a good chance your switch isn't being grounded. It's supposed to be grounded through this screw and maybe the other bottom one. Nope, just this one. So you need to make sure that screw is installed and actually fits and is actually tight. Otherwise, you won't have ground to your wiper switch, and I think some of the speeds won't work right. Things get goofy. Anyway, the point is, you need to make sure your switch plate here is grounded. Now, someone has added a ground wire to do that in this car, and that's fine. They also added a ground wire over here to make sure the cluster is grounded. It definitely is. It's screwed to the dash. But the one thing I could say about ground wires is they work better when they're attached like tightly to things. I've got the cluster pulled forward. Now I'm unhooking everything. I did have to pop the speedo cable off to get it to this point, which is easy enough because there's a switch panel shaped hole over here. Now I'm popping all the wires and the bulbs out of the back. Note, these are labeled. Not that you can see it from this angle, but it's pretty easy to get everything back where it goes. Also note, the amp gauge connections on this one are not looking too hot. And that red terminal, well, I think it's literally been hot, and also it moves around a lot. You know, I've never seen any amp gauges trying to burn cars down like people are always talking about on the internet, but this is about the closest I've ever encountered. Now, luckily, we do have a couple spare clusters to deal with here for parts. The amp gauge is messed up anyway, so I guess we'll be changing that. Maybe the whole cluster. Okay, obviously someone's been in here before. That's creative. And yeah, this, not so good. I don't think this one's winning with us anymore. I think this is probably our cluster donor. The textile on the gauges is a little bit different. That's probably fine. Amp gauge actually might read correctly. Speedometer looks nice, not as rusty as the one that came out. It looks like this cluster's been restored at some point, or at least the amp gauge has been replaced, judging by how shiny and fresh everything is there, except the one nut I transferred over from the other cluster. This is probably going to be our guy. Now, I will bench test the fuel and temp gauges before I ever attempt to install it. In case you had any questions as to why I want to replace this harness, I've got some answers. For one thing, there are weird little repairs everywhere. The stuff down here behind the ignition switch connector is just terrifying. I may have shown you that before, I don't remember. It's been months I've been working on this video now. But also, all of this is supposed to be wrapped in electrical tape. I found one random wire just going off behind the heater box. No idea what that was for. It's brown. It's not connected to anything. Maybe it's orange. Orange is usually dash light. Speaking of which, I mentioned that the connection for the light bar here goes up through the side of the dash. It goes through an opening back here and then loops around and goes to this. Now this is called a candelabra for possibly obvious reasons. Notice everything in this one is orange. So again, that one is for dash lights. This is nice because it's a split for all of the different factory connections, but you can also use it to do things like power the backlights in your aftermarket gauges. Now there's more than one of these in here. There's a pink one right here. That is for the cigar lighter and other battery accessories. And there should be a key power one around here somewhere, which I believe is yellow. Pulling the ashtray and the ashtray housing out can help make room to get into the wiring harness here. Of course, a section of it goes back behind / under the glove box. some goes to the heater box, and at least one wire goes over here to the door jamb switch. You're going to have a wire on the back of the cigar lighter, which in this case was unplugged, and there's another orange wire for the light here in the ashtray, which was going to that same candelabra. Note, I did have to remove the driver's side kick panel to get into the door jamb switch wires, and to unhook the rear lighting harness. This also has the fuel gauge sending unit wire in it. Note, this had been hacked up and repaired before. This pink wire goes to a glove box light, which I don't think works, but I'm going to leave that in place. I need more hands for this. Here's the wiring from the blower motor resistor mounted up on the heater box. Fish that out. I don't know what this mess is. Emergency flasher, maybe? I've always removed the glove box to do this, but actually you can reach back above it and grab this other harness. You can see it's just kind of floating over there. All we need to do to fish that through is pop off the passenger side kick panel and get that door jamb switch unhooked. And then we'll be done over here. I've still got to unhook the column stuff, remove the connectors from the other side of the firewall, and then pop that out with the fuse panel. I'm going to need someone to explain to me why I'm suddenly humming the song Steal My Sunshine by 90s Canadian pop rock icons Len. I pulled this out separately, the thing that was confusing me. That connector is the same as a flasher connector, but I don't actually know what this is for. It's some kind of option harness. It tagged into the pink candelabra, and then there's a ground wire and whatever this mess is. Door jamb switch disconnected. If you're not familiar with these, on these e-bodies, for whatever reason, it's a 2-wire switch. The wires are yellow and black. On many other applications, it's a single wire, and it's grounded through the switch here when the door is opened. So this harness is now completely free, and it should be able to fish it back through. Now, I did notice something, and I don't know if I pointed this out. This car's got power windows. The harness is running through that chunk of AN line for some reason. That harness is actually totally separate from everything else. It's here, and it's going along the bottom of the dash instead of the top where this stuff was. So I've yet to find where that's tagged into the main harness over here. I'll figure that out sometime soon, probably. It's mostly taped to this horrible mess of stereo wiring. Did I mention it's horrible? Lots of zip ties involved there. Anyway, hopefully the window harness doesn't actually have to come out. I doubt it does. Now I'm trying to get the firewall connector out, and I'm dealing with this whole other thing. You see, the main feed wire into this car has been ruined through this connector before, which is not at all uncommon. It's been drilled through, and a large wire was sent through the middle. Here's the thing, though. It had a splice on this side, and then a splice on this side, and then a length of the original wire, which comes to this, a 3M snap lock connector. Yeah, then it goes into this length of wire, which is just shoved under this nut on this breaker. The breaker's a fine thing. 100 amp breaker. Cool. Then there's another chunk of wire with another crimp connector, another crimp connector. That's fed by this wire, which has another poor crimp, and then a butt splice, and it comes off of this. So this dinky little wire is powering this entire car through, like, I don't know, a lot of crimp connectors. Incidentally, this crazy setup of splices and goofiness is almost exactly the same as the 73 Challenger, on which I fixed this problem like 3 months ago, I think. Well, it's out, but I didn't enjoy it. It had to go out the bottom. I couldn't get the firewall connector between the defrost vent and the aftermarket stereo there. With that done, I'm working on the replacement harness now. Of course, this is a good used harness. We don't really know the status, but it looks to be in pretty good shape. Not much hackery has happened here, although all of the light bulbs for the dash lights are broken, or at least most of them. So I'll have to fix that before it goes in. Bigger issue though, there's a good bit of corrosion on the contacts for the fuses in the fuse panel here. So I knocked out the old fuses. I've scraped all of these contacts, and then I came in with some magic cleaning spray, by which I mean brake clean, and blew all those connections out. Here's a towel I put underneath, and there's all the goo that landed on it. So I know this is an improvement. I would be using electronic cleaner if I had any. Also, if I had any dielectric grease, I would hit these connectors with that, but I don't. So now I'm just going to put some fresh, not broken fuses in here, and we'll move on. Got all the broken bulbs out and replaced them. Didn't even cut my hand once. So now I think this is ready to go. I did also wire brush and spray the firewall connector. Probably a good idea. And dielectric grease appeared as if by magic, so now I'm going to protect these terminals with it, and I did surround the fuses as well. Hopefully that'll do something. Here's our old horrible mess of wiring next to our new, slightly less horrible mess of wiring. I did find one important wire cut on this harness, which is not great, but incidentally it was cut on the old one too, and it's already jumped around the ignition harness. It It's not at all uncommon to see burn spots in these wiring connectors, and wires will be removed and jumped around them. I've actually shown doing exactly this in previous videos, incidentally also on a Challenger, where apparently this is very common. I need to clean the corrosion out of that too. Anyway, I'm going to extend this wire going to the ignition switch, and I'll just add a little chunk that'll go to the pre-existing splice, and we'll be good to go with that. This yellow wire is also jumped around it in the car right now. Not sure if I'm going to try and put it back in the connector or what. After a lot of swearing and irritation, the new harness is in place. It is routed just as the old one was. All of the connectors are in roughly the right spot. And we're pretty much ready to reinstall the cluster, the switch panel, and all the other little bits. I did find that this stereo is not fully wired. The power wires are just kind of hanging out under there. And actually, the harness for the stereo itself was not plugged in at all. I'm not sure if there's a reason for that or what, but yeah, it doesn't work. Right at the moment, I'm not going to be rectifying that. I'm just trying to get everything in the car working that matters. Now, I did make a repair to this harness. I didn't source a whole spare one. I just kind of added a new wire. I've tied it in with the main harness, and I tucked the original wire back in there as well, so it's still in place if someone wants to put it back. It is long enough to connect to the firewall at that end with a new end, and over here, if a fusible link were added, it could connect right back to the relay where it's supposed to. I added in this wire myself. I put a new ring terminal with some heat shrink on this end where it connects to this breaker, and then it goes into the connector there. Now, I did not have a factory type click-in metal piece, which is fine because the plastic's drilled out and it wouldn't have clicked in there anyway. So I used a generic type spade connector, and it's kind of wedged inside the plastic to where it can't come out without removing that connector, and it does seem to be firmly attached in there. So I'm good with that. Even so, I'm likely going to add a shunt wire. Now, I've talked about this in various videos over the years, but essentially what that is a charge bypass that goes from the alternator straight to battery positive, or generally straight to the big terminal on the relay over there. That takes load off of the factory charge circuit, the amp meter, and that firewall connector, which happen to be the most common sources of electrical system maladies on these classic Chrysler products. So the shunt wire is a great modification. I haven't done it yet, but I will at some point. At this point, I'm ready to install the cluster. Before I do that, though, I am going to make sure the fuel and temp gauges work. And the way I do that is using power off of the battery, a couple little jumper cables, and the quick application of ground to the signal side of those two gauges. Now, I've shown how to do these tests before, way back when I did a video called Classic Chrysler Fuel Gauge Problems and Diagnosis. It's something like that. And I cover all of these steps there. The Cliff Notes version of this test procedure, you need battery power going to the feed side of your gauge limiter. You need ground going to the bezel here because, of course, that grounds the limiter. With that done, connected to the battery like so, you should get a voltage coming out of that limiter and going to these gauges, which looks kind of like this. Essentially, it's getting voltage and then it goes away. It flicks on and off, on and off. This, of course, is a factory-type mechanical limiter, so that's why we're seeing that. And as you can see, it doesn't read all that well on this meter. But I'm happy with that. This limiter is definitely limiting. If you've got the fancy electronic style, you may just see a constant 5 to 6 volt reading, and that's fine too. Then you take a second ground wire and briefly touch it to the signal side of the gauges. Here's the fuel gauge. Yep, that does stuff. You can see it jumping there. That again is voltage coming from the limiter and then going away, which is very interesting. And then we'll try the temp gauge. And it jumps right up too. Nice. So we've got two good gauges here, and if everything is good in the harness and in the sending units, they should work in the car too. Now we're ready to reinstall this in the dash. There's everything connected to the back of the cluster. Again, it's kind of easy. They're all color-coded, and the harness lays out right where it's supposed to go, so everything just kind of clicks right in. Just pay attention and make sure you're not yanking these sockets away from where they fit happily, and you're probably going to be good. Good news! I made it this far before realizing that this is not a 1970 housing, despite what I thought the date code said. Or maybe it's because it's the CUDA version and not the Challenger version. I don't know. The point is, everything is exactly the same, except the tubes that hold the light bulbs are taller. On this cluster, the one from this car, they're recessed back behind the gauges. And on this version, they're all the way out here at the bottom of them. So I can't install the bezel. And I have to take this back out and put these gauges on the other housing. All right, I'm done, I think. Well, almost. I guess I should put the switch plate in and test things. Here's the no fire. Okay, no fire yet. I suppose this is a good time to realize the wires for the door jamb switch are cut off on this harness. Hey, we got running lights. All right, lots of annoyances, but there's one point to the good. Okay, and I had to play with the panel light knob just a little bit, and then of course this needs to be touched to ground. We've got 2 bulbs in the cluster panel working. This one over here is bad, so I'll replace that. Once I get this whole take the dash back apart and fix the gauge cluster thing fixed, we'll screw this in and we should have lights. There's no backlight in the slapstick shifter right now, which is really unfortunate. That actually changes colors, which is super cool. So I'm gonna need to fix that. It's a week later, and I'm trying to be done with this Challenger. As mentioned, I need to repair that ignition switch wiring, and here's part of how I'm doing that. This is the yellow wire that was cut. For some reason, the starting of this thing was run through a switch when it got here. I pulled out the one that had been cut. I extracted the bits of wire. I reopened the crimp there. Of course, it hadn't been soldered, so I should be able to just pop this right back on that yellow wire, crimp it in place again, reinsert it in the plastic, and we should be good. The red wire is going to bypass the switch connector, which is fine. Tell you what, I'm getting about tired of standing on my head. Okay. Pack the wires in the crimp piece. This yellow one is a relatively low load circuit. It just triggers the starter relay, so that doesn't have to be perfect. Which is good because there's not much room to work here and this crimp might be terrible. All right, I'm gonna shut the camera off and say bad words. Admire the fact this car is marking its territory. That seems to be power steering fluid. Don't really know what that's about. There has been mysterious oil on the battery this whole time, so I assume it's spewing out of the pump and occasionally being thrown everywhere by the belt or wind or something. If I played my cards right, this thing should now crank and hopefully run. Let's find out. Fuel gauge is moving. Nice. And the amp gauge works as well. Blinkers? Yes. Nice. No cranky. What did I do? Are we not neutral safetying? All right, hold on. I think that's the brake warning, and I don't know why it's stuck on. High beam indicator works too, so that's cool. Anyway, yeah, I knocked the ground off the Wait, it just worked! Okay, obviously I need to figure something out here. What relay are you? Okay, so you know how I just repaired the wiring to this ignition switch because after I repaired the wiring out there in the engine compartment, it worked normally, 100% of the time, always cranked, no problem. Well now, sometimes it doesn't put out crank power, but then sometimes it does. And I also don't know what's up with the relay thingy over there. Of course, it wasn't plugged into anything before and it is now, but I just used the power probe. I checked all the circuits everywhere. It is absolutely an ignition switch problem. And as you can see, it's putting power out everywhere else it needs to, but it will not crank. Is it powering the fuel gauge now? I actually can't tell. I don't know, it worked a minute ago. Anyway, this is maddening. So I guess it does need an ignition switch. Luckily, you know, one was supplied, but I'm kind of running short on time for this. All right, we're still good on gauges, so I don't know what's up with that. Sending unit, I'm sure. It moved once, you know. It has the capacity to work. So now I'm taking apart the column to change the switch. Found the horn wire was disconnected from the button, and when you ground it, it actually does relay stuff, but I don't think there's any horn out there. Oh yeah, I know there isn't, actually. E-body columns are even more annoying than most because there's a giant crush can here, so the important nut is all the way down there inside the can. I've got to pull the wheel and then get a socket and an extension. And then once that's out, I have to figure out how to get it loose. You know, I thought I was about to go for a test drive. Detour from the ignition switch I don't want to do. I'm going to get this cluster thing figured out. As I pointed out when I tried to reinstall the bezel, these lights are in a different position on the 70 Challenger cluster compared to all the other base clusters. And it's funny because you put these next to each other and you look at them. The plastic is exactly the same. Yes, the gauge faces are different, but everything else about them is the same. It's just these light positions that make it so you can't swap between the two. And again, this must be 70 CUDA, but anything else but a 70 Challenger should be the same as this. So here's what I'm going to do. Because I've got good fresh gauges in this one, a slightly nicer bezel on this one, and the original speedometer here, which has the correct mileage. I'm just going to swap these 3 gauges into this cluster, and we should be good with that. The plastic is held onto the cluster itself with these little rivety guys, which just kind of pop out. On this one, half of those have been replaced with Phillips screws. I'm going to see if I can just put the right clips back in. Note the Chrysler emblems and part numbers on these things. They also say Introl, though. And I know Introl supplied the oil pressure sending units. Apparently they supplied these voltage limiters as well. So maybe they just built these clusters and sent them to Chrysler. I'm not sure. Tom's not paying attention, so he turned the heater on. Anyway, popping the clips out is really easy with a pair of needle nose pliers. You just kind of squeeze and press. Of course, doing it while holding a camera is a little complicated. Ta-da! That one will actually fit. Yay! Replaced this bulb in the dash, but it still didn't work. The little ground tabs are loose on this socket, and also this one doesn't fit all that tightly and doesn't always light. So now I'm messing around with that. Come on. There you go. Rad. Still gotta tighten that middle one though. Look at this! A dome light! Turns out the wire that was cut in the kick panel was for that. So I repaired it, and also the door jamb switch wires. Dash lights. Still all working, I think. That one's still a little goobery. Anyway. Dude, it just cranked. I hate this thing. I fixed the horrible sound. I wish I hadn't. This is a headlight warning only, not a key warning buzzer. That's actually because the key warning switch wires are all missing, and I'm fine with that. All right, I had a hunch this was what was causing the brake light to stick on, and I was right. This random wire here that's black, for some reason, someone decided to ground. But that is not a ground. That wire is supposed to go down to the shuttle valve there, and if there's ever a brake failure where the shuttle valve shuts off one circuit or the other, it activates the brake warning switch through that wire. I took it off of ground, and I'm going to do this. I don't happen to have the connector to fix it properly right now, but at least the brake warning won't be stuck on. And it should now work with the parking brake. Well, maybe not. Anyway, it was a nice idea. I think that switch is messed up too. Well, the dash is all back together. The dome light works. The running lights work. Dash lights work. Usually, the annoying buzzer works. It's much improved. I don't know if it actually wants to crank right now. It does! Sometimes it even sounds pretty good. It charges, that's cool. I am still planning to add a shunt wire to this thing for safety. We also need to address the power steering leak. And I'm sure I'm forgetting something else. Oh, passenger side kick panel. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Little things. I seem to recall this thing didn't run the best. I think it's fixed. Idle, please. Maybe. Yeah. Nice. Sounds beastly. Just a big block doing big block things. Hey, does this thing leak coolant too? That's weird. Well, maybe it leaks coolant only. It looks oily though. I gotta like leave, but I've come this far. I think I gotta drive this thing. Oh, maybe the transmission leaks too. Maybe everything leaks. The exhaust does. It's been so long since I started this project, I can hardly remember what it was like when I got to it. I know it was really bad, and it did not run this well, so I don't know. Seems, let's say, better. Hey, the light for the heat controls is even working. Nice. Also note, you cannot see anything. Okay, that's better, but it's still quite bad. I don't understand this. You saw me retension the pins. What is going on here? All right, teething problems. Anyway, like I was saying, big improvement everywhere. I have absolutely no idea how much fuel is in this thing. I'm hoping not to find out the hard way. seatbelts. What a good idea. Oh, right. This has a slapstick shifter. I forgot the light for that doesn't work. That would be a nice improvement. I'm just going to let it shift itself, though. Oh. Is there no kickdown at all? Also, this thing handles like a wet noodle. Oh, this is bad. Okay. I guess we already knew it needed a front end, but it really needs a front end. Right on cue, that front right suspension bushing started creaking again. Hey, the brakes are all right. There is no power steering assist for some reason. Okay, obviously you're not going to be able to see this, but I'm going to try shifting it manually and see what the power is like. Hopefully it's overwhelming, and hopefully this thing doesn't shoot off into a ditch. Okay, it's pretty good. And needs some more tuning. A little bit of popping back there, but man, it's got some torque because 440. All right. Whee! Yeah, brakes. That is a lot of car. Oh man, that was a really annoying job if I'm honest, but I think it was all worth it. Everything works, it runs all good now. Yeah, it handles terribly, but there's still a long uphill battle to get this car where it's going. I do believe eventually it's going to be restored properly, but obviously that's not today. Right now, this is a working, almost drivable 440 Challenger. And that's pretty great. Just a few horrible burning fluid smells under the hood. No big deal. Obviously, there's still some loose parts here, but I think my involvement with this car is done. It's all this stuff coming out of the hood. You know what? I don't want to know. Hopefully you enjoyed that. It took a while, but I finally did. In any case, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, if it ain't leaking, it ain't running right. Dude. Now it's just magically fixed again. Okay. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to drive home in my reliable modern Challenger with a trunk full of 426 Hemi parts.